pleasure to be here. Doesn't seem that long ago that I was on the MIT campus. I still have recurring nightmares that it's 2 weeks to the final and I haven't been to class and I don't know where the class is and I'm not sure I can get the books and who's in the class, whose book can I borrow. I really have this like every week. So I think it's a metaphor for something in life. I'll tell you a little bit about my story. I'll start in 1868. As you may know, I'm interested in radical life extension, but I'm not quite that old yet. My mother's mother, Regina Stern, started a school in Vienna in 1868 called the Sternschule. And it was the first school in Europe that provided higher education for girls. If you were lucky enough as a girl in mid-19th century Europe to get an education at all, it went through at most 9th grade. This went from kindergarten to 14th grade, through high school and the first 2 years of college. It was very controversial. What is the point of doing that? It was a common challenge. She went around Europe and lectured on both the importance of educating girls and women and how to go about it. School became influential on women's education, really changed the paradigm. Her daughter, my grandmother, became an exemplar of her philosophy, became the first woman in Europe to get a PhD in chemistry, took over the school. They ran it for 70 years and then fled Vienna a few months after Hitler annexed Austria, abandoning the school. Aside from its role in women's education, an innovation that they practiced, and I remember my grandmother telling me about this, was learn by doing. They had the idea that the best way to learn something is actually try to do it or try to invent some new concept. So they would have the women, the girls, try out new things, and it's actually quite enterprising of an idea for early 20th century. She wrote a book about the experience called One Life is Not Enough. She wrote it on a manual typewriter, and when I was 5, she showed me the book and the typewriter. As a 5-year-old, I was more interested in the typewriter than the book. I took an interest in the book later on. It was called One Life is Not Enough, which does presage my interest in life extension. And to me, this was a magical machine. You could actually take a blank piece of paper and turn it into something that looked like it came from a book. That's quite magical. I'd never seen anything like that. And I was interested in parlor magic, and I would give little magic shows, and I realized that if people could see how the magic worked, the magic went away. But that was not the case with technology. I didn't have that word as a 5-year-old, but I could see exactly how the typewriter worked. I studied all the linkages, and it was still magical. So I decided to create more magic like that, true magic, as opposed to the parlor magic I'd been used to. And so I went through the neighborhood and gathered little mechanical and electrical mechanisms, bring back broken bicycles and broken radios and other little contraptions and take them apart. This was an era where you would allow a 5-year-old to go through the neighborhood and do this. You'd probably get arrested today if you let your 5-year-old do this. And I created this big inventory of little gadgets. And I had this idea, if I could just figure out how to put these things together, I could solve any problem. I remember talking to these very big older girls, I think they were 10, and explaining I'm going to be able to go to the moon and cure diseases and do all these things if I could just figure out how to put these things together. And I remember a comment they made, "You've got quite an imagination, kid." So I fashioned myself an inventor. Other kids were wondering what they were going to be. My inventions didn't get much traction until I was 8. I created a virtual reality puppet theater. So it was a puppet theater, and I could control the world. I could move the trees and sun and stars and people and move their limbs from a mechanical a control station, which controlled everything through mechanical linkages. And this was a big hit in my 4th grade class. I discovered the computer when I was 12. Hardly remarkable today. I walk through airports and it's hard to find anybody over 2 who's not using a computer. But when I was 12, there were only 12 computers in all of New York City. And so I actually found one and borrowed some programming manuals. This was at Flower and Fifth Avenue Hospital in Spanish Harlem in New York. They gave me the night shift from midnight to 8 a.m. I wrote some software for the Head Start program, which was it's the pioneering program in preschool education, doing analyses of variance and other statistical tests to show that preschool education was having an impact. I became the software engineer for Head Start. And I actually had the idea that you could recreate reality and intelligence on a computer, particularly when the program was doing its calculations. Computers in those days had front panel lights, and the lights would sort of flicker, and it really looked like it was in deep thought when it was calculating answers. And I imagined that it was thinking, and I began to think about thinking. So when I was 14, I discovered artificial intelligence. That field was brand new. Most people hadn't heard of it. It had only gotten its name 6 years earlier at a 1956 conference at Dartmouth, where Marvin Minsky and John McCarthy came up with that term, artificial intelligence, which a lot of us think is an unfortunate name because it makes it sound like it's not real. Just like virtual reality is not real reality. So I think these are unfortunate terms. But I wrote Marvin Minsky a letter in 1962. The artificial intelligence field had already bifurcated into 2 warring camps. One was called the symbolic school, where we try to define intelligence in terms of logical rules. So if you want to do something intelligent, you just follow these rules. And the rules can get very complicated, but we can write down the rules for everything and create intelligence that way. And then there was a connectionist school, where we don't try to define anything, but create some rough simulation of how we think the human brain works with neurons. And they're randomly connected, but they will self-organize based on experience with data. And these 2 ideas emerged very early. The connectionist school was making fantastic claims. There was a professor, Frank Rosenblatt, who had the first popular neural net called the perceptron, and he was saying, well, someday this is going to cure diseases and translate languages and play master games of Go, and he was making all kinds of fantastic claims. Couldn't do any of those things, but he was promoting this. It was on the cover of Time magazine, called Giant Brain. So I wrote Minsky, who was head of the symbolic school, a letter. He invited me up to MIT, spent all day with me as if he had nothing else to do. He was a consummate educator. He became my mentor for 55 years until his passing 18 months ago. And he was quite hostile to the connectionist school. What's not widely known, even today, is that he actually invented the connectionist school. He invented the neural net in 1953, but he didn't talk about that much. And he said, well, where are you going now? And I said, well, to see Dr. Rosenblatt. He said, don't waste your time with that. But I went up to Cornell. It had a camera, so I brought printed letters, and it could do a perfect job of recognizing the letters so long as they were in Courier 10 type style. Showed it a different type style, it didn't work. And he said, well, don't worry. I can take the output of one perceptron and feed it as the input to another perceptron and feed that as the input to another perceptron. As we add more layers, it'll get smarter and smarter and generalize and ultimately solve any problem. I said, well, that's interesting. Have you tried that? And no, but that's high on our research agenda. Things didn't move quite as quickly back then as they do today. He died 9 years later, 1971, never having tried that. Turns out to be a brilliant insight. well, I'll come back to that. 2 years before he died in 1969, Minsky, with his colleague Seymour Papert, wrote a book called Perceptrons. On the cover of the book, there was two maze-like images. And if you looked at it carefully, you could see that one maze was completely connected and one was not. Being able to tell which image is connected is called the connectedness problem. And the book basically proved a theorem that perceptrons could not solve the connectedness problem. And the book was very successful in killing all funding for neural nets for 25 years, something that Minsky regretted actually shortly before he died, because that idea was taking off. So about 25 years later, the field started trying multi-layer neural nets. And indeed, they were a little smarter. But we couldn't actually go much beyond 3 or 4 levels. There was a math problem. The information would kind of disintegrate as you passed it from one net to the other. That math problem was actually solved by a group of mathematicians, including one of my colleagues here at Google, Jeff Hinton. And now we could go to any number of levels. And the system that won the Go championship recently was a 100-layer neural net. An accusation against the field 5 or 6 years ago is you guys can't even tell the difference between a dog and a cat. Well, it turns out that's actually a pretty subtle distinction, and it exists at level 15 of a neural net. So when we could only go to 3 or 4 layers, we couldn't do that. Now with a 100-layer neural net, we can actually tell the difference between a dog and a cat and thousands of other categories and do it better than humans. The tremendous excitement about artificial intelligence comes from 2 things. One is this ability to go to many different layers of a neural net. And it's really a pretty amazing insight that Rosenblatt had in 1962, that a multi-layer neural net would be able to generalize and get more and more intelligent, because he had never tried even a 2-layer neural net. And that is one of the approaches that is underlying this tremendous excitement in artificial intelligence. The other is what I call the law of accelerating returns. 1981, I realized that timing was critical to success as an inventor. The inventors whose names you recognize, like Thomas Edison or Larry Page, were in the right place with the right idea at the right time. And timing turns out to be very important for lots of things. You have to show up for your final on time. Timing is important for everything from stock investing to romance. You got to be in the right place at the right time. So I started studying technology trends. I started with the common wisdom that you cannot predict the future. But being an engineer, I gathered a lot of data on technology trends. And I made a very surprising discovery. There's actually one thing that's amazingly predictable about the future, and that is that the price, performance, and capacity, not of everything and not of every technology, but of every information technology, follows a very predictable path. And that path is exponential. So I had, for example, a logarithmic graph of the calculations per second per constant dollar, which is a measure of price performance of computation, going back to the 1890 American census, and it's a very smooth graph, and you don't see any evidence of things like World War I or World War II or the Great Depression or the Cold War. People say, well, it must have slowed down during the recession in 2008, but that's not the case. It has a mind of its own. And it turns out to be true of these basic measures of capacity and price performance of every information technology. I used that then to, for example, I made a curve of computation out to 2050. We're now 36 years later, and it's exactly where it should be. It's really, we just updated, I have a team that updates this data. We just updated it through 2015, and it's right on the curve. It's really pretty remarkable. And what is predictable is that it's exponential, and our intuition about the future is not exponential, it's linear. When we walked through the fields 50,000 years ago and our brains were evolving, we had linear challenges. We'd say, okay, that animal's going that way, I'm coming up the path this way. we're going to meet at that rock. I don't think that's a good idea. I'm going to take a different path. That became good for survival. That became hardwired into our brains. We didn't expect that animal to speed up as it went along. We made a linear prediction. And the primary disagreement I've had with my critics is we both look at the same world and they make a linear prediction. For example, halfway through the Genome Project, 1% of the genome had been collected, and mainstream critics concluded, well, I told you this wasn't going to work. Here you are, 7 years, 1%. It's going to take 700 years, just like we said. That was linear thinking. My reaction at the time is, oh, we finished 1%, we're almost done, because 1% is only 7 doublings from 100%. It had been doubling every year. Indeed, it was finished 7 years later. That's continued since the end of the Genome Project. That first genome cost $1 billion. We're now down to $1,000 per genome. And every other aspect of biology as an information science is progressing exponentially. Our ability to understand it, to model it, to simulate it, and to reprogram it. And so that's been the basis of my futurism, is basically to take these very predictable exponential trajectories and then draw conclusions from them. So that's the other thing that accounts for this tremendous surge of excitement in AI, because we need a lot of computation, a lot of memory, a lot of data, and all of that is expanding exponentially. I mean, just since I've been here at Google 5 years, we've multiplied more than 100-fold the amount of data and computation and so forth. There's still a problem, though, which is it's a motto in the field that life begins at 1 billion examples. And one of the reasons I'm here at Google, and one of the arguments that Larry Page made, I gave him an early copy of my most recent book, How to Create a Mind. He liked it. I asked him for an investment in a company I'd started to develop those ideas. That's how I went about things as a serial entrepreneur. And he said, well, we'll invest, but let me give you a better idea. Why don't you do it here at Google? I said, well, I just started this company to do this. And he said, oh, we'll buy your company. And I said, well, how are you going to value a company that hasn't done anything? It was started 2 weeks ago. And he said, well, we can value anything. And, but his main argument was we have 1 billion examples of pictures of dogs and cats and a lot of other things, and lots of computation and lots of resources. But there's a lot of situations where we don't have 1 billion examples. You need annotated examples. So you need a picture of a cat, and it needs to say cat, and then a neural net can learn that, and then ultimately generalize from it. If it sees 1 billion examples of these kinds of phenomena, we don't always have that. So there's different ways around that, but that's the big challenge now in artificial intelligence. So, for example, AlphaGo, from the DeepMind subsidiary of Google, put every online move of master human Go players online in their computer and had the neural nets learn from that. It's not 1 billion examples. It was 1 million examples. And from that, it created a fair Go player, but a good amateur could beat it. So where are they going to get 1 billion examples when it took decades to collect 1 million examples? Well, they were able to generate their own data by having that, fair system play itself. And you can annotate the moves because you know which side of the simulated game eventually won. And now you could create an unlimited amount of training data, basically by having it play itself. And so they would watch the metric of this ranking of this AlphaGo program as it kept learning from its own playing, and it just kept going up and finally soared past human performance. They recently created a new system, AlphaGo Zero, where they dispensed with the 1 million human examples and just started from no examples. So it started with completely random play, but played itself, and within a few days was actually able to defeat AlphaGo 100 games to 0 in a tournament. And they actually had it learn its own annotation, so there are new innovations. So I had a conversation actually the other night, when can we use that paradigm? So we can use it in math, because math is very well defined and we can create simulations that are essentially perfect. There are a lot of situations you can't do that with. for example, simulating biology. We do have biological simulators, but they're very imperfect. And so the neural nets will learn imperfect information. But sometimes you can bootstrap, you can have some real data, and then create a simulator that's actually quite good based on the real data, and then you can create more data basically through simulation. So for example, the self-driving cars do that. They've gone 3.5 million miles with real cars in real city situations, and from that they created a very good simulator, and in the simulator they've been able to drive tens of millions of simulated miles. I had a different thesis on how to learn based on how I think the human brain works. That's a remaining advantage of humans. Humans can learn from a small number of examples. Your professor, your boss, your significant other tells you something once or twice. You can actually learn from that. At least some humans have been reported to do that. And generally, neural nets can't do that. They can't learn from just a few examples. So I was thinking about how humans do this. So I wrote a paper, this back in 1962 when I was 14, as to how I thought the human brain worked, and I described it as a series of modules. Each module is kind of a small neural net, can learn a pattern, but they're organized in a hierarchy. And you don't need many examples to create a new module. And I didn't count them then, but it accounted for many of the phenomena of human thinking. I've been thinking about that for 50 years. I submitted a paper on that. That's how I got to meet President Johnson, because I was one of the winners of the Westinghouse Science Talent Search. And 50 years later, I wrote How to Create a Mind, which has the same thesis. And now there's an explosion of neuroscience evidence to support it. The European Brain Reverse Engineering Project has identified a module of about 100 neurons that's repeated 300 million times. That's a real number in the neocortex. That's the outer layer of the brain where we do our thinking. And we can see the wiring of each module does not change. There's no plasticity. It stays the same throughout your life. The wiring between the modules is constantly changing, and we can see it's a hierarchy. So in one module, we'll see axons coming from other modules, and then the output of that module goes as an input to another module, and it's a big, elaborate hierarchy. And as we go up the hierarchy, things get more interesting. So at the very bottom of the hierarchy, the modules that, let's say, the optical nerve spills into can tell that that's a straight line. At the top of the hierarchy, it will make judgments like, oh, that's funny, that's ironic, that's beautiful. So things get more interesting as you go up the hierarchy. And something interesting happened 2 million years ago. You might remember we were walking around. We didn't have these big foreheads. Primates have a slanted brow. So we developed the frontal cortex. Up until recently, it was thought that it does such different things like language and humor. It must be different than the rest of the neocortex. We now realize that it's really just additional neocortex. So what did we do with it? Well, we were already doing a very good job of being primates, so we put it at the top of the neocortical hierarchy. And that was the enabling factor for us to invent language and humor and music. Every human culture discovered has music. No other primate culture has music. That all came with that additional neocortex. And so my thesis, there's a number of steps in this, but we will ultimately add more neocortex. Miniaturization is another exponential trend. If you jump to the 2030s, we'll have computerized devices that are the size of blood cells. There'll be little robots with intelligence, communication, sensors, actuators. They will augment our immune system. That's a major factor in life extension. They'll go inside the brain and provide the signals to your brain that it would be receiving if you were in the virtual or augmented environment. So we'll have augmented and virtual reality from within the nervous system, unlike the external devices that we're doing today. But most importantly, it'll connect the top layer of the neocortex to the cloud. And this is actually several billion times more powerful per dollar than the computer I used when I was at MIT. In fact, I went to MIT because MIT was so advanced, it had a computer. And thousands of us shared this one computer. This is thousands of times more powerful. It's 1 million times less expensive. That's a several billion-fold increase in price performance. But that's not the most interesting thing about it. It makes itself 1 million times more powerful again by connecting seamlessly and wirelessly to the cloud. And it actually isn't that interesting without the cloud. So a kid in Africa with a $50 smartphone can access all of human knowledge with a few keystrokes because it amplifies itself and its knowledge, its insights, its intelligence by connecting to millions of computers in the cloud. We can't do that from our brains yet. We do it indirectly through these devices. These are brain extenders, even if they're not inside our brains. Ultimately, we'll connect our brain directly to the cloud, and not just to do things that we do now with these devices like search and translation, but to connect to simulated neocortex. So now the neocortex, the hierarchy, will be a combination of our biological neocortex and this non-biological extension. That's what I'm doing here at Google. We don't have perfect models of the neocortex, but we have some idea. And with these imperfect models, we're already able to understand language, not at human levels, but we can do some impressive things. We'll have very good models as we get to the 2030s, and we'll be able to connect our neocortex wirelessly to synthetic neocortex in the cloud. And so our thinking will be a hybrid of biological and non-biological thinking. And it'll be just like 2 million years ago, where we added additional neocortex. That event 2 million years ago was a one-shot deal. The enclosure couldn't keep getting bigger. Birth would have become impossible. Once we can actually have non-biological neocortex in the cloud, that won't be limited by a fixed enclosure. The cloud is pure information technology. It's growing exponentially as we speak. And so we'll do the same thing we did 2 million years ago. We'll put it at the top of the neocortical hierarchy. And so we will become funnier and more musical and develop expressions we couldn't even understand today. Just as we did 2 million years ago, try explaining music or humor to a primate that doesn't have a frontal cortex. So by analogy, that's what we will do in the future. So thank you very much.
So the next part of this session is going to be questions from you all. We have a few questions to kind of start it off, and then it looks like there are a couple questions that have been submitted through Poll Everywhere. I believe this is the same link that you were using before, pollev.com/UIfellows. So now that we've heard Ray's thought-provoking talk, if you have any questions that have bubbled to the surface, please submit them. To start off, you talked a little bit about your work here at Google, but can you describe a little bit more about specifically what your team is working on here?
Right, so I came here to try to understand natural language and to move Google search from just keywords and links and type of signals that Google gets when you select a search query, a search response, to actually understanding the meaning of language. If you have Gmail and use it on your phone, you should notice it gives you 3 suggestions for replies. It's called Smart Reply. That's software from my team. So we need to actually understand the emails in order to give a response. The responses are brief, but they need to be appropriate. There was concern here that, gee, if even 2% of the responses are really off the mark, we're going to get 1 million posts. Look at this ridiculous suggestion that Google made. And we're not getting that, so it actually works quite well. We have a whole bunch of products that basically take advantage of its ability to understand natural language. And we're continuing to work on it. It's not as good as humans, but I think that's actually what's called a Turing complete task. Alan Turing in 1936 devised his eponymous test, the Turing test. Basically, a human judge talks over what he called teletype lines, basically instant messaging, to AIs and humans, and if the human judge can't tell the difference, who's human, who's an AI, then we say that the AI has passed the test. There was a report a couple of years ago that the computer had passed the Turing test, but that was apocryphal. Basically, the chatbot was simulating someone that didn't understand English very well, and so people were convinced that maybe this is a human that doesn't understand English, but that's not really a valid test. I've been consistent saying that this milestone will be achieved by 2029. The significance of it has been debated, since he wrote that paper. I believe it takes the full range of human intelligence to pass a valid Turing test. There's no sort of simple natural language tricks you can use that would do that, particularly if you have a judge who's insightful and can really probe the computer's knowledge of the world and follow up things that have been said earlier in the conversation. So we're not at that point yet, but it does appear to have a pretty good understanding of language and is able to do search based on meaning.
Thank you. So one question which has been getting a lot of interest is, do you think that sentient AI is attainable, and if so, how long do you think it will be before that happens?
Sentient means conscious, and that's actually a philosophical question. How many of you are studying philosophy? Okay. So that's been a key question, and I've written extensively about this, and fundamentally it's not a scientific question. There's no falsifiable experiment you can run that would definitively say, okay, this entity is conscious, this one isn't. There's no consciousness detector you could build, slide something in, the green light goes on, okay, this one's conscious, this one isn't. That doesn't have some philosophical assumptions built into it. So John Searle at Berkeley would want to make sure that the entity is squirting biological neurotransmitters, otherwise the green light wouldn't go on. Dan Dennett, an AI philosopher at Tufts, would want to make sure that the system had a model of its own thinking, and that's the key to consciousness. But these are all kind of leaps of faith. So some scientists, and my mentor, Marvin Minsky, at times took this position, but he wasn't consistent on this, would say, well, it's not scientific, so therefore it's just an illusion, let's not waste time on it. That's not my position, because our whole moral system is based on consciousness. It's only the conscious experience of conscious entities that are important. A non-conscious entity is only important insofar as it affects the conscious experience of a conscious entity. So you have to determine who and what is conscious. So the whole animal rights issue and debate is about, are animals conscious? To what extent are they conscious? So I think my cats are conscious. Not everybody agrees with that. I think they haven't met my cats. But it's fundamentally a philosophical issue, but I think it is the fundamental philosophical issue. It determines our sense of value. Is basically based on the conscious experience of conscious entities. So I say you have to have a leap of faith, or you couldn't really be an actor in the world. My leap of faith is that basically if it acts conscious and seems conscious, meaning it passes a valid Turing test, then I will accept it as conscious. And I also make a prediction that people will accept that. And I think we'll have to accept it because they'll be very clever, and if we don't accept that they're conscious, they'll get mad at us, and we wouldn't want that. So I believe that computers and AIs will be sentient when they pass a valid Turing test, and I've been saying 2029 for that. But I do want to add one other point. My view is not the view that you see in lots of AI dystopian futurist movies where there's the AI versus a brave band of humans and they have a battle for control of the world. I believe we're going to merge with it, as I alluded to earlier. That's why we create tools as extensions of ourselves. We couldn't reach fruit at that higher branch 1,000 years ago, so we created a tool that extended our reach. Who could build this building or skyscrapers with our bare hands? We've leveraged our muscles with our machines. We can now access all of human knowledge, as I mentioned, with a few keystrokes. And we're going to extend our knowledge and our intelligence with these devices. These devices are already brain extenders. Nobody could do their work or get an education without them. And we're getting more intimate with them. I had to take my bicycle across campus as an undergraduate and show an ID to get to the computer. Now we carry them around. We're using them all the time. They are starting to go inside our bodies and brains. That'll be ubiquitous in the 2030s. So it's not us versus these sentient machines. We're going to merge with AI, and it's going to expand our sentience and our consciousness.
Thank you. So we have a lot of AI-related questions here, but I'm going to go rogue and ask my own question. So you have done a lot of entrepreneurship and inventing, and you've also looked a lot at the trajectories of emerging technologies. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to what it's like to be an entrepreneur developing technologies that nobody has heard of, nobody knows how to use potentially or how to regulate, and maybe share some advice for other entrepreneurs, since I'm sure we have a lot in the room who have great ideas for new technologies.
Well, it is a scary thing to do, although there's a lot more support for it than there used to be. It's a little bit like mountain climbing. You look at the great vista ahead, but then you look down at the side and you see this crevice that you could fall into. There was very little support for it when I went to MIT. I started my first company in 1974, which made the reading machine for the blind, and the Omnifont OCR and a flatbed scanner. That year, there was total venture capital for technology in the United States was $10 million. That's a small deal today. And entrepreneurship, these terms did not exist. Venture capital just barely existed. It began to formulate in the late 70s. I got my first venture deal in 1977, but it was a brand new concept. We basically started our company with angel capital, which really, angels basically is like your relatives and friends, and so you really have to put yourself on the line. There's still an element of that, although it's well established now that this is a key to the future of humanity, and so there's a lot of support for it. I go around the world and people say, oh, this is the Silicon Valley of Paris, and this is the Silicon Valley of Israel, and it's become a metaphor for trying to change the world through ideas. One of the key attributes of that is to redefine failure. That failure is really experience. In a lot of cultures, failure is a disgrace and shameful. But you can't really succeed in anything if you're not willing to fail and actually fail a number of times. Singularity University, we started really to celebrate this idea of entrepreneurship. And it really combats something that's we see in the scientific world, but actually in the world in general, even in music and art, of this increasing specialization and narrowness of many different fields, and people in one field don't understand the terminology in another field. And but the solutions to problems are actually found at the intersections of many different fields. So I think it's important. Being an entrepreneur really means trying to imagine what is possible. I used the law of accelerating returns as a guide to really see what will be feasible at different points in time, and I think that's been a very important tool, so I could time my own projects. But a lot of people don't have that imagination. I read business plans, I do some early stage investing and mentoring, and people will talk about the world 3, 4, or 5 years from now as if it's the same world as today. Look back 5 or 6 years ago, the whole idea of mobile apps didn't exist. And lots of things that have transformed the world. We can't remember when it wasn't the case, but it wasn't the case just a few years ago. And the world will comparably change in the future. So you need a rich imagination, but you need a lot of commitment. I think if we understood all the problems we would encounter, we'd never start any project. So you need to be optimistic, but optimism is not an idle prediction about the future. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Thank you very much. So another question that has floated to the top is, so you talked a bit about nanobots and, or well, whatever they would be called.
Nanobots.
Devices that could be in the brain that could make it cloud enabled. And so the question is, when the human brain is cloud enabled and everyone can know everything with the aid of these devices, what does the future of human interaction look like, do you think?
Well, I think we'll find profound new ways to communicate. We did that the last time we expanded our neocortex and created music and poetry and language. It was actually our first invention. And that was a way of getting together and collaborating, either personally or in terms of solving problems. Having only 300 million neocortical modules is very limiting. It used to sound like a big number, but now there's such big numbers thrown around in high tech that it doesn't sound that big. But if you and I get together and can communicate, now we have 600 million, and the community has even more. So as we actually get smarter, we'll have actually better ways of collaborating. We see that already. Collaboration tools are allowing groups of people who don't know each other to actually get together and think as one community and solve problems that could never be solved before. There's a series of math problems that several hundred mathematicians got together and were able, through collaboration tools, to solve for the first time. And that's also happening in biology and many other fields. And I think we'll be able to have richer forms of communication. And I don't think we're all going to become the same. I actually think this will enable us to become more different. Right now, we're not that different. We all have the same neocortical architecture. We learn somewhat different things and have some different attitudes as a result. But if we can have a bigger neocortex, we'll actually be able to go even more deeply, let's say, into music or science than we can now. And we're seeing that already, but when we can actually extend our neocortex, we'll move profoundly in that direction.
Thank you. So I think with any emerging technology, and AI is no exception, there are definitely ethical questions and dilemmas that come up. So one question that came up is, again, talking about connecting our brains to the cloud. Do you think that if that was the case, that there could be the possibility of hacking into people, and how, like, what could be done to potentially prevent or mitigate that issue?
Well, that's a huge issue. At companies like Google, there's a tremendous amount of effort on security and privacy, and despite periodic breaches, we're doing quite well. We already have a lot of our thoughts in the cloud. I mean, all your emails, messages, and which is a lot, represents a lot of your thoughts, is in the cloud. And that's going pretty well overall. So that's definitely an issue. But to broaden that question a bit, the whole issue of promise versus peril is a big issue with technology in general. Fire kept us warm, cooked our food, but also burned down our houses. And these new technologies are much more powerful than fire, and there's intertwined promise and peril. I've been accused of being an optimist, and as I said, you have to be an optimist to be an entrepreneur, but I've written a lot about the downsides. In the 1990s, I wrote a lot about that. The Age of Spiritual Machines, which came out in '99, had a lot about the existential risks of biotechnology, nanotechnology, and artificial intelligence. And so there's been a lot of debate about this. Some people, like Musk and Hawking, act as if they've just discovered that there's dangers to these technologies. I think we go through at least I went through three phases, and I recommend people go through these three phases in contemplating promise versus peril of any of these exponential technologies. First is delight, like, wow, this really has potential to overcome age-old afflictions of humanity, poverty, disease, environmental degradation. Then alarm that, oh, this could be destructive, could be very destructive. And finally, I think where we need to come out is that we have a moral imperative to continue progress. We've actually made a lot of progress. That's a whole debate on its own. People go around the world and people actually think things are getting worse, which is absolutely not the case. I just mentioned one thing. There was a poll of 24,000 people in 26 countries, and they were asked, is poverty worldwide getting better or worse? 90% said incorrectly it's getting worse. Only 1% identified correctly that it's fallen by 50% or more. There's tremendous progress in every area. This is the most peaceful time in human history. People say, what, are you kidding? Don't you pay attention to the news? Well, our information about what's wrong with the world, including violence, is getting exponentially better. Steven Pinker documents in his book, Better Angels of Our Nature, exponential decline in violence. But anyway, there's still, despite that progress, a lot of suffering, and it's only continued progress in biotechnology and AI and every other field that's going to alleviate human suffering, while we attend to containing the peril. And there's a good model for how to do that. So we've had for several decades, for example, the Asilomar guidelines in biotechnology, and we're now getting profound clinical impact in biotechnology. For example, we can now fix a broken heart, not yet from romance, that'll take some more advances in virtual reality, but from a heart attack. We're growing organs. We could talk all day about biotechnology. It's a trickle of clinical application today. It'll be a flood over the next decade. And the number of people so far who have been harmed by accidental or intentional abuse of biotechnology so far has been zero. Now, that doesn't mean we can cross it off our list. Okay, we took care of that one, because it keeps getting more sophisticated. We haven't dealt with all the ethical implications of CRISPR, for example. But it is a good paradigm for how to keep these technologies safe. And the Asilomar guidelines are very detailed ethical and practical guidelines and strategies to maintain the safety of this technology. We just had our first Asilomar conference on AI ethics and how to keep our AI safe. Elon Musk was there, and we had a 4-day dialogue about that issue. So I think that is the paradigm to reap the promise while we contain the peril, and I think that's the big challenge for humanity over the next several decades.
Thank you. And for those in the audience that haven't heard of the Asilomar conference, could you just describe really briefly what?
Well, 40 years ago, there was a group of visionaries that saw the promise and the peril of biotechnology, which is, biotechnology is basically treating biology as software and reprogramming it. So a very good example of doing that now is immunotherapy in cancer. The immune system doesn't combat cancer on its own. The immune system evolved in an era where it was not in the interest of people to live very long, and so it didn't select for combating diseases that get us later on in life. We're now reprogramming the immune system to go over after cancer. That's a tremendously exciting paradigm. It's just one of many examples. Now, 40 years ago, these people were visionaries because neither the promise nor the peril was anywhere close at hand. But they held a conference at the Asilomar Conference Center in Asilomar, California, to talk about ethics and strategies to keep this technology safe, to reap the promise and control the peril. And the guidelines that came out were called the Asilomar Guidelines. They've been updated every few years for the last 40 years, and a lot of it's baked into law. And it has been, as I say, effective. There's been no abuse. And it doesn't mean we can rest easy, but it does show that that strategy is effective.
Thank you. So one last question, then I think we'll need to wrap it up. Can you describe a little bit about your process in general for solving problems?
Well, I'll mention two things which are unrelated. I came up with the law of accelerating returns to time my own technology projects, and that's been the basis of my futurism. It allows me to invent with the technologies of 20 years from now. I can't build those things now, but I can write about them. So I've written various books about the future based on that thesis. And it has tracked very well. It's not just looking backwards and overfitting to past data, because I started 36 years ago. And the predictions have been very effective. There was an analysis of 147 predictions I made in the Age of Spiritual Machines, which came out in '99, about the year 2009. 86% were correct. The ones that were incorrect were directionally correct, like we'd have self-driving cars. We didn't quite have them in 2009, but it was off by a bit. But the ones that were close to really being based on these precise measures of price, performance, and capacity were remarkably accurate. But I use it still primarily to time my own technology projects and to try to start a project before it's feasible, but not 20 years before it's feasible. So you can kind of meet the train at the station, have your technology ready, when the overall enabling factors will be in place. Another completely unrelated answer is I've used a technique of lucid dreaming that works as follows. It's described in, I've written 3 health books, and the last one's called Transcend. There's a sleep chapter, and it's described in there in detail. But each night I assign myself a problem. And it could be a basic technology problem or a math problem. How am I going to solve this problem? It also could be a decision. Should I hire this person or do this deal, or an interpersonal challenge in a relationship? And I try not to solve the problem, but I try to think, what do I know about it? What are possibilities for solutions? So Freud said that the sensors in your thinking, CENSORs, are relaxed in your dreams. That's why you'll dream about things that are culturally taboo, because you don't have these sensors we put in our thinking. Well, there are also professional sensors. Like, you can't solve a signal processing problem with those formulas. You can't use this approach for linguistics. We have all kinds of restrictions on our thinking that we're not even aware of. All of that's relaxed in your dreams. So if I wake up, I'll find myself dreaming very obliquely about the issue that I assigned myself. There's something else that doesn't work in your dreams, which is your rational faculties. So the strangest thing about the elephant walking through the wall in your dreams is that you don't think it's strange in your dreams. So you really can't rationally evaluate your ideas. So I've got all these creative ideas that break certain restrictions on our ordinary thinking, but I can't really evaluate them. So the next stage is in the morning, and this doesn't work if an alarm goes off. You have to kind of get into this in-between stage between dreaming and being awake. So I'm kind of still in the dream. I've got the dream feelings. I've got access to the dream ideas, but I'm aware that I'm in a bed. So I also have, so now I have my rational faculties. And I'll try to take, say, 15, 20 minutes and think about how do these strange dream ideas relate to the problem I assign myself and try to interpret them. And it doesn't always work, but very often I'll get insight into a decision and have confidence in the decision, or a whole new idea for an invention. I've gotten up and then written the patent application, or I'll have a solution to a problem. So I feel as I go through the day, I'm just kind of carrying out my dream decisions. But I've found this a useful technique.
Thank you. Those are some very unique answers to that question. So can we go ahead and give a big round of applause for our speakers?